It begins in silence, behind closed doors in Johannesburg, where African leaders gather with representatives of the BRICS nations. There are no cameras, no reporters, and no official speeches. Instead, there are maps spread across long tables, figures scribbled on documents, and one question whispered over and over. Can Africa and BRICS together build a financial system strong enough to free nations from the grip of the IMF? For decades, the International Monetary Fund has been both a lifeline and a burden for African states. Loans were granted in times of crisis, but always with heavy conditions. Taxes were raised, subsidies were cut, and governments were forced to accept policies written not in Ouagadougou, Bamako, or Harare, but in Washington and Brussels. Families lived under austerity, schools closed, hospitals ran short of medicine, and generations grew up carrying debts they never created. Now, a new idea is circulating among African leaders. It is simple in principle, yet revolutionary in consequence. What if Africa could align with BRICS, the group that includes Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, to create a system of support that bypasses the IMF altogether? Instead of borrowing money tied to conditions, African nations could trade resources, gold, and technology in exchange for fair partnerships. Instead of paying back loans with interest, they could build development banks owned by themselves and their allies. The implications are staggering. If successful, such a plan would strike at the very foundation of the IMF's influence and weaken the dominance of the US dollar. For many in the West, this is not just an economic adjustment. It would be seen as a challenge to the world order established after World War II. If you remember the oil shocks of the 1970s and how they disrupted American households, stay with us, because this story carries a similar power. The tremor this time does not come from oil shortages, but from gold, resources, and the will of Africa to break free with the support of BRICS. At the center of the secret discussions is an idea that would have seemed impossible just a decade ago. African nations, led by voices from the Sahel, are considering a financial alignment with BRICS that could rewrite the rules of international lending. Instead of waiting for loans from the IMF, burdened with strict conditions, they envision an African partnership with the BRICS New Development Bank. This institution already exists to support projects in member countries, but the plan is to expand its influence deep into Africa. The heart of the proposal is to use Africa's greatest strength, its resources. Gold, uranium, oil, and agricultural goods are not just commodities to export for quick cash. Under the new plan, these assets would become the foundation for new credit lines. Nations like Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger would no longer walk into IMF negotiations as debtors. They would arrive as shareholders in a system backed by real value. A finance minister from West Africa, speaking privately, put it simply, "We are tired of paying debt with our children's future. It is time to use what we have, not to sell it cheaply, but to build our own independence." His words capture the spirit of the movement. The mechanics are ambitious. Instead of borrowing dollars, African states would conduct transactions in their own currencies or in BRICS-backed settlements. Gold reserves would be pooled, creating a shared guarantee for new loans. Development projects, from highways to hospitals, would be funded without the austerity programs that have so often crushed social services. This is not only about economics. It is about dignity. It is about the ability of a nation to decide its own budget, without permission, from a distant boardroom in Washington. To understand the radical nature of this plan, one must look at history. The IMF was created in 1944 to stabilize the global economy after the devastation of war. It became a tool of Western power, tying financial aid to political alignment. In the 1980s and 1990s, many African states suffered under structural adjustment programs that cut food subsidies, raised fuel prices, and privatized essential industries. Entire generations remember the pain of these policies. The promise of BRICS is not simply better financing. It is liberation from a painful cycle that has lasted for half a century. Of course, the plan is not without risk. Critics warn that shifting toward BRICS could create new forms of dependency, particularly on China. They argue that African states may find themselves trading one master for another, but supporters insist that the difference is crucial. With BRICS, the foundation is trade and shared resources. With the IMF, the foundation has always been debt. In the streets of Ouagadougou, the discussion feels less technical and more emotional. Young people speak of a future where their universities are funded by African banks, not foreign donors. Farmers imagine a world where fertilizer and tractors come through partnerships that respect their work, not through loans that chain them to repayment schedules. Even in churches and mosques, the conversation is alive. Leaders preach that financial freedom is as sacred as political freedom. The secrecy of the plan adds to its power. Officially, there is no public statement, but leaks, whispers, and careful hints point to a major announcement in the coming months. Some diplomats claim that pilot projects are already underway, with BRICS testing settlements for African trade in gold and local currencies. Others suggest that a BRICS Africa Bank could soon be launched, headquartered in a Sahel capital. The stakes could not be higher. If successful, the plan would not only weaken IMF control in Africa, but inspire other regions. Latin American leaders are watching closely, remembering their own struggles with the IMF. Asian nations outside BRICS see the possibility of an alternative system that offers dignity instead of debt. But for every step forward, there is resistance. In the West, powerful voices are warning that such a system would not be tolerated. The question now is clear. How exactly would this new system challenge the IMF's iron grip, and what retaliation might follow? The climax of this unfolding story came during a discreet but pivotal meeting in Addis Ababa. Delegates from several African nations sat across from officials representing Russia, China, and India. The atmosphere was tense, yet filled with expectation. Everyone in the room understood that if this plan moved forward, it would not be just another trade agreement. It would be a direct challenge to the global financial order. At one point, a Chinese representative laid out a proposal. BRICS would provide initial reserves of gold and foreign currency to back an African financial facility. In exchange, Africa would commit its gold, uranium, and oil as guarantees, creating a pool of resources powerful enough to issue loans outside of IMF control. The room fell silent as the numbers were presented. For the first time, African ministers saw a path to financing highways, power plants, and hospitals without submitting to austerity programs written in Washington. The emotional response was immediate. A finance minister from Niger reportedly whispered, "This is the first time in my career that I feel we are negotiating as equals." For those who had spent decades pleading with IMF officials only to be told to cut teachers' salaries or raise the price of bread. This was more than economics. It was dignity. News of the plan quickly spread beyond official circles, igniting passionate reactions on the streets. In Lagos, students marched with banners reading, "No more IMF chains." In Ouagadougou, young people painted murals showing Africa breaking free from shackles labeled debt. In Harare, women's cooperatives gathered to discuss how new credit lines might finally allow them to buy equipment for farming and textile production. The international reactions were swift and divided. In Washington, analysts at the Treasury Department warned that if BRICS succeeded, demand for the dollar could fall significantly. A leaked briefing note described the plan as an existential threat to Western financial leadership, U.S. Media outlets debated whether Africa was simply falling into China's orbit or whether something larger was underway. In Paris, the tone was more emotional. Editorials in leading newspapers described the Africa BRICS talks as a betrayal of historic ties. One French lawmaker declared, "If Africa abandons the IMF, it abandons Europe." The fear in Paris was clear: a loss of influence that could undermine both economic and political ties built over centuries. By contrast, Moscow and Beijing reacted with open enthusiasm. Russian state television praised Ibrahim Traore and other African leaders as visionaries. Chinese newspapers framed the plan as part of a new era of South-South cooperation. Even India, often cautious, spoke warmly of a partnership that could reshape the balance of global development. Not every voice was supportive. In Africa itself, critics worried that turning to BRICS might create new forms of dependency. Some academics warned that Africa could end up trading IMF oversight for Chinese or Russian leverage. Yet among ordinary citizens, these warnings carried little weight compared to the hope of finally escaping debt traps. One particularly emotional moment occurred when an elderly woman in Burkina Faso spoke to a reporter. She recalled how her son had emigrated to Europe because there were no jobs at home, while her daughter could not afford medicine during an IMF austerity period. "If this plan means my grandchildren can live with dignity in their own country," she said, "then let the world call it whatever they want. For us, it will be freedom." The climax is not only in the deals being drafted, but in the symbolism radiating across the globe. For decades, Africa has been seen as a debtor continent. Now it dares to present itself as a shareholder in a new world economy. The cheers in African streets contrast sharply with the unease in Western capitals, capturing the essence of a global confrontation that is only beginning. But hope alone does not guarantee success. The question remains: what consequences will follow if the IMF and its Western backers decide to fight back against this rising alliance? The secret Africa BRICS plan has already begun to reshape lives, even before a single official treaty has been signed. Across the Sahel, conversations in markets, schools, and religious centers reveal a society standing at a crossroads between fear and hope. In Ouagadougou, a teacher named Amadou spoke with quiet pride about the possibility of new funding for education. For years, his school struggled to pay salaries, buy chalk, and repair broken desks, all because IMF-imposed austerity demanded budget cuts. "If BRICS can help us without asking us to starve our children, then for me, it is worth the risk," he said. His words echoed the sentiment of many parents who dream of classrooms with books and electricity, not debt repayment schedules. In rural Burkina Faso, farmers are watching closely. A cooperative of women in Koudougou has long wanted to purchase tractors and irrigation systems, but the only available loans came from foreign banks, with interest rates so high they were nearly impossible to repay. The rumor that a BRICS-backed African bank could provide affordable credit has transformed their conversations. One farmer explained, "If this becomes real, we will plant not just for survival, but for growth. We will finally stand on our own feet." And the civil consequences extend beyond economics. Families who once sent their children to Europe in search of work are beginning to dream of keeping them home. A young man in Bamako said bluntly, "If I can get a job building roads here, why should I risk my life crossing the Mediterranean?" Migration, one of the deepest wounds in African society, may slow if opportunities truly expand at home. Politically, the consequences are seismic. Leaders like Ibrahim Traore in Burkina Faso and Assimi Goïta in Mali are hailed as champions of sovereignty. Murals in the streets depict them holding keys, symbolizing the unlocking of Africa's future from IMF chains. Opposition voices accuse them of recklessness, warning that Western sanctions could cripple fragile economies. Yet the narrative of dignity and independence has captured the imagination of millions, making it politically costly for any leader to reject the plan. Inside African parliaments, debates rage. In Ghana, lawmakers argue whether joining the alliance could expose the nation to economic retaliation. In Nigeria, some officials see opportunity, while others caution that the country's heavy reliance on Western investment makes bold moves dangerous. The divide reveals the deep impact of the plan. It is no longer a distant idea, but a question shaping national strategies. Religious leaders also play a role in guiding communities. In mosques, imams speak of justice and freedom from exploitation as divine rights. In churches, pastors compare the struggle against IMF dominance to the biblical story of Exodus, framing it as a journey from bondage to liberation. Such framing provides moral weight to the economic debate, strengthening public support even among the cautious. The wider African Union faces its own challenge. Some member states welcome the plan, seeing it as the embryo of true continental independence. Others fear that moving too fast could fracture unity by dividing countries into pro-BRICS and pro-Western camps. Meetings are tense, with diplomats carefully weighing whether Africa is ready for such a dramatic shift. Internationally, the ripple effects continue. Latin America, long frustrated with IMF policies, is inspired by Africa's boldness. Politicians in Argentina and Brazil openly speak of expanding the BRICS system to their own regions. In Europe, concerns grow that a united Africa aligned with BRICS could destabilize long-standing trade patterns and weaken Europe's influence over its former colonies. The civil and political consequences, therefore, cannot be measured only in statistics. They are written on the faces of teachers who hope for books, farmers who dream of tractors, and families who imagine their children working at home instead of fleeing abroad. They are etched in political murals, religious sermons, and parliamentary debates. Yet behind every moment of hope lies the shadow of retaliation. What will happen when the IMF and its Western allies realize that their grip on Africa is slipping? In Washington, the whispers of an Africa-BRICS financial pact are no longer dismissed as fantasy. Inside the Treasury Department and the State Department, experts warn that the plan could strike at the very heart of U.S. influence. For decades, the IMF has not only provided loans, but also extended American political power. Countries that accepted IMF programs often found themselves tied to policies aligned with U.S. interests. If Africa can escape that structure, Washington risks losing one of its most effective tools of diplomacy. American think tanks are already debating the consequences. Some analysts describe the plan as a threat to dollar dominance. Others argue that the United States should find a way to cooperate with Africa and BRICS rather than confront them, warning that sanctions or isolation could backfire. They point to the oil crisis of the 1970s as an example of how quickly global shifts abroad can affect American households at home. Europe is equally unsettled. In Paris, commentators frame the plan as the final stage of France losing its traditional sphere of influence. French officials privately admit that if the IMF's control weakens, Europe's economic reach in Africa will collapse as well. The fear is not only economic, but symbolic. A continent that once bent to European power could now stand on its own with BRICS backing. Russia and China see opportunity. Moscow celebrates the plan as a blow to Western dominance, while Beijing positions itself as Africa's trusted partner in building infrastructure and financial independence. India and Brazil, though quieter, recognize the strategic advantage of welcoming Africa into the BRICS fold. Beyond governments, global reactions include ordinary people. In Latin America, citizens who endured IMF austerity cheer Africa's boldness, hoping it inspires their own leaders. In Asia, small states observe carefully, wondering if they too could negotiate better terms outside Western institutions. The central question lingers. Could this be the beginning of the end for the financial order America built after World War II? Or will Washington find a way to stop the Africa BRICS plan before it becomes reality? The secret Africa BRICS plan is more than an economic proposal. It is a declaration that Africa will no longer accept a future written in the offices of Washington or Brussels. If successful, this strategy could be the first real step toward financial independence after centuries of debt and dependency. For nations long trapped in IMF cycles, the promise of development without austerity is as powerful as the dream of political freedom once was during the age of independence movements. Yet the risks remain high. Western nations may retaliate through sanctions, trade restrictions, or diplomatic pressure. The IMF itself could tighten credit lines, sparking short-term crises that test the resolve of African governments. Critics warn that aligning with BRICS could lead to new dependencies on Moscow or Beijing. The road ahead is uncertain, filled with both promise and peril. But the symbolism is undeniable. For the first time, African leaders are not asking permission. They are building an alternative with partners who treat them as shareholders rather than debtors. This alone marks a turning point in the history of the continent. Whether or not the plan achieves its full potential, it has already changed the conversation about sovereignty, dignity, and the right of nations to control their own destiny. The wider world now watches closely. Will Africa and BRICS together create a system that challenges the IMF's supremacy? Or will the weight of Western pressure crush it before it takes root? If this story has made you pause and think about justice, dignity, and freedom, share your thoughts. Do you believe no nation should live forever in debt? If so, let your voice join this conversation. The struggle of Africa is not just Africa's alone. It is a reminder to all people that sovereignty is worth fighting for, and that financial freedom is as essential as political independence. May God bless Africa, may He bless America, and may he guide all nations toward a future where dignity is not a privilege granted by the powerful, but a right claimed by the people.